Hello and welcome everyone. In this lecture today we are going to start a new thinker in Western political thought, that is Thomas Hobbes, and with Hobbes we see a kind of new thinking and theorization about politics, which is very different from the religious modes of thinking about the temporal or the political power and authority in medieval Europe, and also from the ethical or in the sense of virtue having a predominant role in theorizing about the politics in Plato and Aristotle. So, with Hobbes we see a kind of new approach to politics which is quintessentially modern, and that is why with Hobbes we see a kind of beginning of modern political thought. And on Hobbes we are going to have 3 lectures. In the first lecture we will situate Hobbes in the larger social, political and intellectual context of England, and also his views on human nature. So, in the first lecture we are going to discuss these 2 things. In the second lecture we will focus particularly on his Leviathan, or the idea of sovereignty, and how this civic authority or civil authority is something which has absolute power, and what is the justification for such absolute power and authority in Hobbes, and how he argue such absolute form of authority on the basis of a state of nature. So, all these theorization about sovereignty, state and its justification of absolute power and authority we are going to discuss in the second lecture. And in the concluding lecture on Hobbes we will particularly focus on his theory of political obligation. So, in modern political discourse the obedience of the ruled or the people or the governed is not given like in the monarchy, or like when we have the divine right theory of politics and the temporal politics. Now, with modernity a government or the state must justify or legitimize its rule by getting the obedience from the people. The consent of the people or the consent of the rule becomes the basis of the legitimacy for the modern state and the modern government. So, this theory of political obligation as why citizens should obey the rule, not because it commands certain religious authority or certain virtuous notion of life or the ethical promises, but it has to justify in unambiguous terms. So, what is that theory of political obligation we are going to discuss in the third lecture. And also in that lecture we will discuss in the second part the criticism that is labelled against Hobbes. So, Hobbes is regarded as the first modern political thinker in Western tradition. Nonetheless, he creates a Leviathan or the sovereign which takes away all the rights of the individual and the citizens. So, what is the point of creating that order which will jeopardize all kind of liberty or the choices that individual may have. So, what are the criticism against Hobbes we are going to discuss in the concluding lecture. So, in this lecture we are going to start with Hobbes by situating him in the larger socio-political and intellectual context, and also his brief biography before we start discussing about his views on human nature. So, as I said that Thomas Hobbes is the first modern political thinkers, and this you can relate with the Machiavelli political thought that we have discussed in the previous 3 lectures, that Machiavelli is someone who is in between that medieval modes of thinking about the politics and the modern. So, he is a kind of precursor to the modern political thought, but Hobbes truly represents the approach or the methodology to politics that we have in the modern times. So, Thomas Hobbes is the first modern political thinkers who provides us a new paradigm of politics. So, the reason for regarding Hobbes as the first modern political thinker is also because the kind of methodology, the kind of approach or the language that he deploys distinguishes him from the previous political philosopher. So, he deploys a kind of scientific and objective. So, we will see that how he defines human nature and how that human nature leads to the creation of a state, which is the artificial construct, and why such artificial constructs should exercise absolute power over those who construct them in the first place. So, the justification that he provides, the language that he deploys and the approaches that he has is very different, very scientific and objective from the previous medieval political thinkers or the classical era political thinkers, and that distinguishes Hobbes from the earlier tradition of political thought and thinking. So, he has a very scientific and objective approach to politics or the political phenomena, and the characteristic part of Hobbesian political theory is its unambiguous language, and that unambiguous language about the politics he regarded as the science of politics. Prior to that, there is a kind of subjective speculation or contemplation about politics, as for instance in Plato certainly, but also to a great extent in Aristotle is there. So, he rescue in a sense political thinking and theorization from the subjective speculation of a particular thinker. In other words, a kind of science, a kind of objectivity or a kind of neutrality that he deploys in his theorization about politics, theorization about state and political obligation and so on. So, there is a kind of precision of language closer to the mathematical kind of reasoning, that why we should obey the sovereign, why we need a sovereign which should exercise the absolute power. The justification he gives is not on the basis of some religious thinking or some kind of ethical or moral speculation, but he justified it on the basis of the understanding of human nature. What will happen without the state, without the absolute power of the state. So, he provides a kind of unambiguous language to his theory of politics, and in contrast to classical and medieval political theory, Hobbes replaces the notion like virtue, ethics and the religious authority with the idea of liberty or the choice of the individual, which is necessary for the social progress, economic progress and the prosperity of individual as well as the community. So, the idea of liberty and the pursuit of self interest, which is different from the public or the political interest. So, there is a kind of shift in Hobbesian imagination of politics, state and the theory of sovereignty. So, if you remember in Plato and Aristotle, the whole purpose of state or the polis is to create a condition where human beings can realize his her true potentialities. So, the best possible life or the fullest expression of one's skill is possible in the associational life of the community, in the polis. Here in Hobbesian thinking, that public and the political part of human life is replaced with the private pursuit of interest. So, Hobbesian political thinking regards the individual as a private person, and it is perfectly okay if that private person pursue his her particular interest and do not participate in the public life. So, the very existence of politics and a state then is to create the condition for the people to A, secure his life and provide him or her the freedom to pursue his personal or private interest. So, there is a kind of decisive shift in and that to a great extent becomes the understanding of politics today. So, we live individualistic life and we demand the state to provide law and order. In other words, provide the condition where we can pursue our personal interest. So, it is not necessary like in classical time to also proactively participate in the famous Aristotelian dictum, ability to rule and being ruled in turn. That does not define citizenship. Citizenship is a kind of passive personal life of the individual, and a state is there to provide the condition of law and order where individual can pursue personal interest or the particular interest. So, that kind of shift is there in Hobbesian thinking which becomes the basis of modern political thought and thinking or theorization about state and so on. So, he replaces the notions like virtue, ethics and religious authority, and how he does so we will discuss as we proceed with his understanding of human nature, his understanding of state of nature and so on. So, Hobbes' philosophy of social contract is also something which gives the existence of a state and its legitimacy a new paradigm. So, state is not something given, it is not something which is natural, it is the artificial construct of the human beings when they come together in the larger good of their protection of life and liberty. So, the existence of a state is dependent on the contract among the individuals when they come together. So, his philosophy of social contract then becomes the kind of basis or the foundation for thinking about politics, state, citizens and their obligation to state in modern political discourse. So, in modern times when we think about why should we obey the rule of the state, why should we obey the command of the rulers, the reason being that the ruling or the government in modern times is regarded as based on the consent of the ruled. So, we are not for some religious, ethical or moral reason expected to obey the rule or the government. We obey the government because we choose the government in the first place. So, there is a kind of tacit consent that citizens give and thereby provide legitimacy to the government, and once that consent is there, that becomes the ground of our obligation, and that is something new in Hobbesian thinking. And here there is a kind of language of contract like in the corporate world or the world of industries. So, human beings as the free individual is not subjected to obey the commands of other because of religious or ethical moral consideration, but because he or she in his free will think that that rule or that government or the obedience to that rule or the government is in the benefit of their own life and liberty. So, this language of contract becomes the basis of modern political discourse about state, citizenship, obligation and so on. So, beginning with the social contract tradition, thus the modern state is seen not as a natural or given entity, but an artificial construct. So, human beings coming together through contract and covenant constitute a legal and corporate entity which we call a state. It is not given, it is not religious, and this is a corporate legal entity which must provide certain security or which must perform certain duties for the people to obey its command. So, there is a kind of give and take relationship here between the state and the citizens. So, the existence of the state is not for its own sake. It must provide the condition for the human beings to pursue their personal interest, and so long it is able to provide that condition where individuals can pursue their personal interest, that state is legitimate, and therefore, the citizens should obey its command. So, it is a kind of contract between the two party, the state and the citizens, and that makes the state in modern conception a kind of legal and corporate entity with its well demarcated territory. That is the characteristic of modern state. It will have a very precise, clearly demarcated territory. It is not like ambiguous boundary in pre-modern times during the era of empire and other forms of political authority. Here the territory of the state is well demarcated with its legitimacy and monopoly of coercive means or violence. So, state as a corporate legal entity enjoys certain legitimacy and monopoly of coercive violence. That distinguishes modern state from other forms of political authority, and the legitimacy of this state as a corporate legal entity with monopoly of violence within a given territory rests so long as it is able to provide the condition for individuals or for the citizens to pursue their private interest. So, there is a kind of different take on the understanding of a state participation in the public political life, and in the Hobbesian conception we will see later on how it creates a kind of condition for the bourgeois society or modern capitalist society to emerge, to flourish, and it is rooted in that modes of thinking where the prosperity, industries, trade and business is regarded as the necessary for the happy life or for the human satisfaction, for the protection of the community and so on. And for that you need a state which will exercise absolute power, the sovereignty which is indivisible, which is non-transferable. So, this kind of imagination of state as a legal corporate identity with monopoly of violence is rooted in this idea of new subjectivity, which does not necessarily enjoy or forced to participate in the public life of the state. Hobbesian individual is regarded as perfectly okay if he or she does not take any interest at all in the political matters. But the politics or the state and its existence is legitimate so long it provides the private citizen the condition for the pursuit of their personal interest. So, according to its Hobbes, its authority, that is a state's authority, is sustained based on the legitimacy and the obedience it commands from the citizen. So, according to Hobbes, politics is part of civic philosophy which should share the methods and language of other branches of knowledge such as natural science and particularly geometry. So, we will see later on how when Hobbes theorized his conception of state or sovereignty and why such sovereignty should be absolute, what are the justification, he developed a very scientific, objective and a kind of mathematical language. So, there is no ambiguities there. So, why we should obey the rulers? Because if you do not obey, there will be the war of each against all, and then it will create a condition where the prosperity in life, trades and business becomes impossible, and the life will be nasty, brutish and short, and therefore, we must obey the command. So, the language that he deploys is unambiguous, very precise, and the role of definition becomes the central part of his development of political theory and political thought. And there he regarded that we should follow the method of natural science, particularly mathematics or geometry. So, his theory of state sovereignty is based on the understanding of human nature, which we are going to discuss in today's lecture. Thus, Hobbes builds his theory not on the premise of heaven or ethical or moral consideration, but based on the exact understanding of human nature. So, the whole artifacts of Hobbesian political philosophy is based on the understanding of human nature, and that we will see as we move on in these 3 lectures on Hobbes' political philosophy. So, Hobbes' justification for the creation and sustenance of a state or absolute sovereignty is nearly mathematical in terms of its precision. So, he argued that to establish order, the state which is the result of association of free individuals coming together and contracting together to form a commonwealth would ensure the life and liberty of the individuals and thereby create the condition of prosperity and industry. So, that is the basis of the justification of the state and its absolute power, which is the result of the people who are free individual, and they come together and then have a kind of contract among themselves, and through that contract a state emerges, the sovereign power emerges, and the existence of such a state and sovereign power is based on its ability to create the condition for the human beings to pursue their interest. And so long that state or sovereign provide those conditions, its authority or its power is legitimate. Once it fails to do so, human beings have the freedom to come together and create the new sovereign or create the new state and so on. So, that is the premise of Hobbes' political theory. Now, we try to situate Hobbes in the larger socio-political and the intellectual context of England of 17th century, and this you connect with the methodological lectures that we have, that the thinkers and their ideas can be better understood in their historical context, in their socio-political context. And most of the political theory and theorization develop in the context of turbulence, in the context of crisis, and it is equally true in Hobbesian political theory. So, Hobbes was developing his political theory during a turbulent period in England's history. What was that turbulence or crisis in England history? It was a kind of violent struggle between the parliament and the royalty or monarchy. So, there is a kind of tussle or a struggle which was often violent between parliamentary forces which wanted to represent the voice of the people, and these people are not the poor or the multitude, but those who have the property, or in other words the aristocrats, and they pay a tax or revenue to the government, to the monarchy, and once they pay the tax or revenue, the monarchy should be accountable to their opinions, their views and their scrutiny. So, there was a kind of tussle between the parliamentary forces which represent the interest of the aristocrats or the nobles or the propertied class, and the monarchy. Parliament, which was representing the interest of the nobles or the aristocrats and not the poor, unlike today where we see the parliament as the representative body, reflects the will of the people, and modern democracy is supposed to function as per the will of the people reflected in the parliament through their representative. That is the basis of the legitimacy of modern democracy, modern liberal parliamentary state and so on. So, unlike that, parliament in 17th century England was the group of the people who were propertied, who were from the noble or aristocratic families, and they wanted to check the power of the monarch or the power of the royalty. So, parliament representing the interest of the nobles and the aristocrats, not the poor, was attempting to curtail the absolute power of the monarchy, and monarchy, in contrast to the parliament, claims to represent the will of the people or the interests of the people and not just the propertied class. And this tussle leads to civil war, violent struggle between the parliament and the monarchy, and there was a kind of polarization in the society between the forces of royalty on the one hand and parliamentary forces on the other. So, it led to English Civil War from 1642 to 48 or 49, and it ended with the beheading of Charles I, the King of England, in 1649, and the establishment of the leaders of the parliamentary army, which was Oliver Cromwell's rule. So, there was a kind of political turmoil or instability when Hobbes was trying to construct a new theory of politics or a new theory of political order. So, there was the restoration of monarchy in England in 1660 after the death of parliamentary leader Cromwell in 1657, but the factionalism between the parliament and the monarchy continued in one form or the other. And more specifically, monarchy claims to represent the views of Catholic Christian religion and the non-conformist, which resulted in the religious war also. And when we discuss Locke, we see how tolerance is regarded as necessary for the political stability. So, after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, there was a kind of factionalism between parliament and the monarchy, specifically between Catholics and the non-conformist, which continued and settled to a great extent in 1689 with the passage of Toleration Act. So, once the parliament passed this act, there is kind of some understanding between these two factions, and it was this ceaseless struggle between the royalists, parliamentarians politically, and Catholic Church and Protestant movements religiously, which shaped much of the political turmoil and confusion in 17th century England and also in Europe. So, historically for the European continent, the 17th to 19th century was a period of much of political instability, new imagination of political power, new thinking about the state, and the conventional authorities such as Catholic Church or the absolutist monarchy was unable to provide political order or command the obedience of the people, and that required a new discourse, new thinking about politics, which Hobbes in a sense provided. So, there was a search for new forms of political authority and their legitimacy. Divine right theory and the Catholic Church or even the absolutist monarchies were unable to command obedience from the people. So, Hobbes' political philosophy in a sense then, particularly his theory of sovereign or the Leviathan, in some sense institutionalized the Protestant reforms movement maxim that says reason is religious. That means it was up to the king to decide religious orthodoxy, and that was a kind of movement towards the secular politics in modern political discourse, particularly in the Europe. As a result of religious war, the competitive struggle for authority between the Catholic Church and the absolutist monarchy, which resulted in the Treaty of Westphalia, and with that a kind of understanding that the monarch who governs the territory, which rules the territory, so decide the religious orthodoxy in that particular territory. So, that leads to the creation of Church of England and modern reimagination of religion, which should not dictate the temporal power or the political power, but it should work within the sphere of political power or the political authority. So, Hobbes' conception of sovereign or the Leviathan to a great extent institutionalized this Protestant ethics, the outcome of the religious war or religious intolerance that was prevalent widely in the European continent among the Catholics and the Protestants, among the royalists, among the parliamentarians and so on. So, Hobbes' political philosophy thus developed in a context of the rejection of the Christian metaphysics and the revival of Greek, Roman classics and humanist traditions. So, Copernicus in astronomy, Galileo in physics, Francis Bacon and Descartes in philosophy were extending the boundaries of or the frontiers of human knowledge, with providing new explanation of planetary movement, the philosophy, human nature, the role of human agency and so on in creating the better society or better understanding of the world in which we live. So, Hobbes' political philosophy was developing in a context where there was a kind of all around progress in every sphere of life, in science, in philosophy, in physics, in mathematics and so on. And that to a great extent shapes the political thinking or theorization of Hobbes. So, Hobbes derived much of the methodological tools from the natural sciences, and we will see later on how he deploys a different language to politics or a different approach to politics, which is free from the subjective biasness or the speculation of a particular thinker. So, he wanted to develop an ahistorical. So, the very basis of the social contract is the idea that a state is not a trans-historical or a historical thing. It is created by the individual when they come together to protect their life and liberty, and in protecting their life and liberty they trade off certain liberty when others also agree to do some similar kind of trade off, and then create a monarchy, create a sovereign with the absolute power. So, this is the artificial construct, and in that artificial construct it is ahistorical. So, he wanted to develop an ahistorical and scientific theory of politics or state that would demonstrate from the first principles the essence of political authority and what rulers and subject must do to avoid war and secure peace and prosperity. So, the whole purpose of politics in that sense is to secure peace, to establish order. That is the precondition for any prosperity, socio-economic and political. So, like Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes also share this anxiety to create a condition of peace, order in the society that is the necessary for prosperity, economic, social and political. However, how in these turbulent times where the conventional understanding or conventional authority fails to command obedience from the people, one can develop a new maxim, new understanding of politics, new theorization of politics, which will lead to political obligation, which will lead to creation of the state where the state and the citizens should function in a manner which will create the condition of political order, peace and stability and thereby prosperity in the society. So, in constructing that political theory, Hobbes deploys a historical method and scientific approach. Now, we will briefly discuss the biography of Hobbes in a sense that he was born in 1588 in Malmesbury, Wiltshire in England, and his father was a clergyman with limited means and few intellectual accomplishment. Hobbes had his education in Oxford with the support from his uncle, and it is in the Oxford that he developed the criticism of Aristotelian ethics and scholastic philosophy, which he thought has very little significance to understand the prevailing circumstances in the real life and also how to improve those circumstances. So, he developed a kind of critical approach to the Aristotelian ethics that was dominant in the university circle and discourses, and also the scholastic philosophy, and his own approach was scientific and materialistic understanding of politics and society. So, the first building blocks, so to say, of politics and society is the individual, and to understand the society and the state one needs to understand the individual, and the way he defines the individual, and we will see it later when we discuss the human nature, is a very materialistic understanding, not any kind of moral and ethical approach to define the human beings and its behavior. And this definition or understanding of human nature or behavior becomes the basis of his theory of sovereignty or Leviathan or political obligation. So, Hobbes developed it in Oxford with his critique to Aristotelian and the prevalent scholastic philosophy, and his own scientific and the materialistic approach to politics and society. Hobbes spent most of his life in the family of an aristocrat, William Cavendish, and despised the rule by people or the multitude. So, in Hobbesian approach, he was very apprehensive about the rule of the people or the multitude, and in that sense he is somewhat controversial figure. And as we will see in the third lecture while we assess his political thought, he was supporter of the monarchy, and also for his thought he was being criticized by the royalty or the forces who supported the royalty. Similarly, he was criticized by the forces of the parliamentary form of government and also the religious authorities of his time. And in that sense, Hobbes has a very peculiar situation to think about the politics and political treatises. So, his political theorization coincided with the Civil War and enclosure movement in England, which was about dispossessing the poor from their land and appropriation by the aristocrats or the newly emerging middle class in England, and that leads to mercantile capitalism and gradually industrial revolution. So, conventional authorities such as church, papacy and the royalty were increasingly challenged by the people, and in the beginning he was the staunch supporter of royalty, and fearing the civil war in England, he spent a good portion of his productive life in exile and spent many years in Paris, France, where he wrote many of the texts including Leviathan. So, however, after the end of English Civil War 1642 to 49 and the execution of Charles I, the King of England, who ruled England without consulting the parliament. So, the parliamentary forces wanted the monarchy to consult parliament, be accountable to the parliament in governing. However, the Charles refused to consult the parliament and ruled England without being accountable to the parliament. That leads to the civil war, and after the execution of Charles I in 1649, Hobbes returned to England in 1652 and he made peace with the new ruler Lord Cromwell, who was the leader of the parliamentary army. However, after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660s and the return of Charles II as the King of England, Hobbes returned to the royal court and received a pension. He died aged 91 in 1679. So, in the Hobbes, in his personal political life, there is a kind of shift from being the staunch supporter of monarchy to coming into terms with the parliamentary leader and then going back again to the monarchy. And in this movement, there is a kind of constant endeavor to avoid the violent or sudden death. So, this basis of avoiding the condition which will lead to sudden or violent death becomes the premise of his all political theory, which we will discuss with the human his understanding of human nature. So, in his personal life also we will see his exile, coming back, support for the monarchy and also coming into terms with the parliamentary forces. So, it is a kind of preservation of life and avoiding the death as the sole basis of political action for the individual, and that becomes the basis of his understanding of Leviathan or the sovereign as well. So, it was in exile that Hobbes came across major intellectuals and scientific luminaries of Europe and cultivated friendship with them, and these men of letters and science were Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, Descartes and others, and he taught mathematics to the future King of England Charles II. It was during this tour in exile that Hobbes came across Euclid's work on geometry, and that becomes the foundation for his political thinking, his obsession with the precision or unambiguous language of politics. So, Euclid's geometries profoundly influenced his thinking and political thought, and his emphasis on the precision of language and the value of definition. So, he defines everything: what is human nature, what is movement, what is voluntary movement and what is involuntary movement, what is sense or what is reason. He defines it very precisely, and if you care to read his text Leviathan, you will be mesmerized by the mathematical language that he deploys. There is so much of logical argument and the coherence from one to the other argument that it creates a kind of mathematical artifacts in a sense, where the premise justify the foundation or the later construct of Leviathan. So, the basis of understanding Leviathan or the sovereign is understanding of human nature and how human beings behave. So, his obsession with the precision of language and value of definition comes from Euclid's geometry. The text is called Elements, and from his reading of Euclid's geometry, that he regarded as the master science and the basis of all sound knowledge. It was on the basis of this mathematical knowledge that Hobbes developed his theory of state, sovereignty and political obligation, and he distinguishes his theory of political science from the past political thinkers, whom he regarded as merely scholastic thinkers, driven by their own subjective understanding and ambiguous and vague descriptions of political phenomena. So, Hobbes wanted political science to be based on precise language, unambiguous terms and definitions, and the construct of theory should be on the basis of these precise definition or unambiguous language. And the other thinkers prior to Hobbes, he regarded as not truly political science, and he wanted to assert that the political science start with his writings in Leviathan. So, Hobbes considered himself as the political scientist, and he boasted about his work as the beginning of political science. So he did not want to give any advice to a prince or a ruler. His only desire was that his works, mainly Leviathan, should be taught and discussed in the universities. Although now Leviathan is taught in major university in the world, in his lifetime he faced significant challenges and criticism from all kinds of authority or powerful groups, be it parliament, monarchy, and also the religious authorities. In fact, there was a discussion in British parliament about Leviathan, and he later on lived a very precarious life, where he had enemy in all camps, in the parliamentary groups, in the monarchy, and also among the religious authorities. So he was hated by the royalists, parliamentarians, and ecclesiastical authorities alike, and the Oxford University condemned Leviathan and burnt it in public. However, 300 years later, it remains the most celebrated text of modern political philosophy in the English language, and that is the strength of his arguments in the text Leviathan. Now, if we look at the major works of Hobbes and particularly Leviathan, Hobbes' first published work was an English translation of Thucydides' History of Peloponnesian War. However, his approach to politics was ahistorical, and his major works on politics and laws are Elements of Law, Natural and Politics. The manuscript was written in 1640, and De Cive he wrote in Latin in 1642, and Leviathan in 1651, which is his mature work. De Cive was later published into English as the Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Government and Society in 1651, the same year when Leviathan was published. And Hobbes also supplemented Leviathan with Behemoth, that is his take on English Civil War, and it is also called the History of the Causes of Civil Wars of England, and it is his take on the English Civil War. However, this Behemoth could not be published in his lifetime. One speculation is because of not getting the approval from the monarch. So, it was published after his death. So, Leviathan is Hobbes' magnum opus, which represents his mature thought. It heralded a new era of political thinking and thought in Western tradition, which we called social contract tradition, and Locke, Rousseau, and many other political thinkers developed this new conception of state, authority, and political obligation on the basis of this understanding of state and its existence as a contract between the ruler and the ruled, the citizens and the state, and so on. So, in its approach to the theory of sovereignty and political obligation, the characteristic of this text is quintessentially modern. It is not rooted in religious, ethical, moral thinking. It is very scientific, objective in its approach. So, in terms of precision of language, certainly, which is almost mathematical, objective, and scientific, this text of Leviathan and his approach to politics is quintessentially modern. Hobbes' Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and the civil, which is the full name of his text when it was published in 1651, is regarded as the most brilliant and influential political treatise ever written in English. It was written in exile in France during 1647 to 50, and it is divided into 4 parts. Of man, we are going to focus it today, of commonwealth, of a Christian commonwealth, and finally of the kingdom of darkness. So, these are the 4 parts of Hobbes' Leviathan, but the major discussion that we have on Hobbes' political thought is limited to the first 2, of man and of the commonwealth, or commonwealth by means the civil authority. What kind of authority will make it possible for the individual to lead a civil life, and the civil life is very different from the public and the political life in Aristotelian political philosophy. So, our discussion on Hobbes is also then limited to this two part of his book, that is of man and of commonwealth only. So, we will discuss from this two part his idea on human nature, state of nature, the theory of state, sovereignty and political obligation, which is the basis of his political thought and thinking. Now, if we look at the human nature in Hobbesian conception, in Hobbes' Leviathan, he begins with a very persuasive account of human nature, which is the basis of all his political theory. So, to understand the whole, to understand the sovereign, it is necessary to understand the constituent of that whole or that sovereign, and that is human being. So, he considered human being as a self-regulating mechanism. It is like a kind of physical understanding or natural science understanding of human being as a matter, as a form, as an entity, which is self-regulating. And what regulates this human being is a complex set of emotions and reason. So, human being as a self-regulating, so there is a kind of very precise definition or understanding of human nature, which is the basis of state, sovereignty and so on in Hobbes. And he defines it in a more mathematical scientific sense, not with any kind of ambiguity or some form of subjective speculation or a kind of transcendental understanding of human nature. So, he considered human being as a kind of self-regulating mechanism driven by a complex set of emotions and reason, and the chief among these is desire and aversion. So, what guides human actions or human movements is his or her desire and aversion. Desire is something which pleases that individual. So, this individual will pursue those course of action which will fulfill his desire, and he will averse those course of actions which does not fulfill that desire. So, that is aversion. So, this human being as the self regulating mechanism or a self propelling entity is guided by this complex set of desire and aversion in its pursuit of actions or its pursuit of what it thinks is good. So, fulfillment of desire according to Hobbes is the source of happiness or felicity. So, the human being constantly searches for happiness, and happiness is not in pursuit of some transcendental idea of ethics or morality or sense of justice, as in eudaimonia of Aristotle and Plato's political philosophy. Here for Hobbes, and it is like the consumerist society. So, human being as a consumer constantly desire to accumulate something, to own something, and in that owning there is a kind of constant search for newer desire, and the state is to provide the condition where human beings can fulfill those desires. So, happiness and the felicity for individual life is then in the pursuit of those desires, which is insatiable. There is no end to those desires. So, human beings are hardwired in that sense with its set of complex desires and reason to behave and act according to their desire and aversion to certain acts and objects. So, why we want something and do not want other things? Can we have a universal understanding of what is desirable and what is undesirable? And it differs from people to people. People should have the freedom to choose what is desirable and undesirable, and in that sense the very definition of good and bad is based on that desire. So, anything that helps the individual satisfy his desire is good, and anything that hampers the pursuit of his desire is bad. So, this understanding of good and bad is very different from the ethical and moral understanding of desirable and undesirable, as we have seen in Aristotle and Plato. So, Hobbes distinguishes between vital and voluntary motions in human beings. The vital movement or involuntary, that means for a living entity such as human beings, there are certain actions which are natural or involuntary, and these are like heartbeats, breathings or bowel movements which are vital for the living. So, human beings do not endeavor or choose to breathe or not to breathe or other kind of vital functions of human life. So, that vital function is involuntary. What Hobbes' focus is on the voluntary actions of the individual which require certain endeavors. So, like speaking, eating and limbs movement, Hobbes regarded as voluntary action, and he regarded these voluntary movements as endeavors which constitute the human will. And these voluntary movements or endeavors cause pleasure and pain for the human beings. So, the source of human beings pleasure or pain is their endeavors, their voluntary actions, their will to participate or not participate. So, the endeavors he further divides into two types, that is towards an object and away from an object. So, human beings guided by their desire and aversion will pursue those things which gives pleasure to them and avoid those things which cause pain to them, and that is how human beings behave. So, now the very definition of understanding to his behaviors, Hobbes has a very precise or unambiguous understanding. He does not regard any kind of transcendental entity or essential understanding of human beings or some kind of teleological imagination as in Aristotle. So, human being will realize his fullest potentiality only in the life of Polis, because he is essentially ethical or rational with a sense of justice or injustice, that is in Aristotle. In contrast to that, there is no such kind of transcendental teleological understanding of what is desirable or undesirable for the human being. He gives it a kind of natural or materialistic explanation that human beings as a set of complex emotions and reasons are guided by their own sense of desirable and undesirable. They desire something which provides pleasure to them and they avoid something that gives pain to them. So, as a self-propelling mechanism, human beings according to Hobbes are driven by their desire or appetite for pleasure and aversion to pain or hatred. So, that is how human beings are shaped. This according to Hobbes, human beings are a bundle of desires or passions and aversions, and to live is to fulfill the desire and passion one after the other continually. There is a kind of ceaselessness, there is no end of human desires and aversions, and so life is meaningful, could be happy, or what he calls the felicity of life requires the human being to constantly, continuously satisfies these desires one after the other. There is kind of insatiability in human desire and passion. So, human beings have sense and reason too. So, the sense or the reason makes it possible for human beings to assess the circumstances, and that senses leads to some kind of rational faculty of calculation, what is beneficial for the preservation of life or for the fulfillment of desire, and what should be avoided for avoiding pains or hatred or fear or death in the life. So, sense and reason is also constitutive of human beings. However, Hobbes does not consider reason as innate to human beings or as inherent. So, reason we develop through our senses, through our perception of the world. So, there is nothing inherently good or bad, as I have said. Good and bad has a very materialistic understanding here. Anything that helps the human being in the pursuit of desire is good, anything that hampers or obstructs the pursuit of that desire is bad and evil. So, human beings develop reason and deliberative faculties through their senses and language, but passion he regards as stronger and more potent than human reason. So, it is the passion that drives the human actions. So, the role of reason then in human being is in helping them to fulfill those desires and passions, to have happiness in the life, to achieve felicity of life. So, and it is the fulfillment and the unfulfillment of desire and passion that, according to Hobbes, cause felicity or happiness and pain in human beings. So, the understanding of pleasure and pain is not based on any kind of ethical moral understanding, but in the fulfillment of the desire or undesirable in human action. So, according to Hobbes, the single most concern for human beings as an automated object or matter in motion. So, human life is also a matter, but this life is constantly in motion, and that gives a kind of dynamic existence to the human being. So, the single most concern for human beings as automated object or matter in motion is self preservation, and to attain whatever each individual holds to be his or her personal and individual good. So, he disconnect the idea of common good or the virtue which is applicable universally to everyone with a very individualistic and the particular understanding of good and bad. So, thus Hobbes, in contrast to Aristotle's teleological understanding of human nature or virtue, argued there could not be any universal definition of good or bad. It differs from individuals to individuals, and he should be free to choose, and the liberty is in this constant movement of human being as matter in motion. So, anything that obstruct or interfere the individual pursuit of the desire or its motion is contrary to his liberty or his or her choice. So, according to Hobbes, he or she should be free to choose and strive for what he or she considers as good. So, for the human beings, what is desirable and undesirable is not for the society or community to decide or for the state to decide. It is the human being as a free rational individual with a sense should decide what is desirable or what is good, and his life is meaningful when it endeavors to fulfill those desires or what it considers as good. So, thus Hobbesian human nature is defined as a ruthless, self-seeking creature of desires for power, success, acquisitions and satisfaction that are wholly selfish and which are more often insatiable. That is the understanding of human nature that Hobbes had. This insatiable desire, according to Hobbes, sustain life, and he defines death as the cessation of desire. So, when human beings have no desire, there is end of life. Being alive means having desire, and the human endeavor should be in the pursuit of those desires which brings happiness to the life. So, the felicity or happiness in life demands satisfactions of desire. So, human beings' reason or intellect is to serve the passion or desire. This, in contrast to Greek notion of searching virtue or truth through reason or intellect, in Hobbesian conception of human nature, the reason is to serve the insatiable desire and passions rather than controlling and regulating them. So, if you recall Plato's human being, the appetites, honor and intellect is supposed to regulate the appetites and the spirit and the honor of the individual to have the harmonious life. Here the reason and intellect is to help the human being in the pursuit of their passion and their desire. So, thus according to Hobbes, human beings are egocentric. All his or her action is to satisfy his or her egos, self-propelling, matter in motion, and life itself is but motion and can never be without desire. So, so long as the human beings are alive, they must have desire, and once they do not have desire, that means death. There is the end of this human being as matter in motion. So, desire causes both the selfish or the altruistic behaviors of human beings. This became the foundation for Hobbes to develop an absolute theory of authority to control and regulate such insatiable desires of human beings, which if unchecked or unregulated would lead to a war of each against all. That would create the condition of a state of nature without regulation, without control. And justification for such absolute authority, Hobbes provides, is based on this negative emotions of fear, and particularly the fear of sudden and violent death. So, human being as the self-seeking creature or matter in motion will give utmost priority to the preservation of life. And if all their actions are self-centric or egoistic, then it will lead to clashes in the society or a war of each against the all. Now, to prevent that condition, you need the authority which has the absolute power to control and regulate these desires, to arbitrate between and among the people. So, that is his justification of absolutist monarchy, which we are going to discuss in the next lecture. So, human beings as the self propelling matter in motion, guided by their selfish desire, gives utmost priority to the preservation of life. They constantly fear their life, and they enter into the contract to create the monarch or the leviathan or the sovereign with the absolute power is to protect their life. So, this creation of a state for Hobbes then is guided by this fear of human being of violent or sudden death, and this you can connect with the civil war, where there is a kind of constant flux, instabilities, violence and death to the individuals and also those who are in the authority. So, the human being as self-preserving creature do everything to protect his or her life. Thus the state or sovereign exists not for the pursuit of common good, but for the preservation of life and personal liberty of the individuals, and that is the basis of his justification for absolutist monarchy or absolute power of the monarchy or the sovereign, which we will discuss in the next lecture. So, that is all in today's lecture on Hobbes, his personal life and the socio-economic and the intellectual context of England and Europe, and also his views on human nature. So, on this lecture today you can refer to these books like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present. Gary Browning is another book on Hobbes, and particularly the interpretation of Hobbes. So, you can refer to his A History of Modern Political Thought. Murray Forsyth and Maurice Kinsuper again gives you a very good introduction to Hobbes' conception of man. So, does Shefali Jha, Western Political Thought. You should also refer to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which is edited and introduced by J.C.A. Gaskin as part of Oxford Classics, published by Oxford University Press. James Allen Ryan you should also refer to on politics, and Patricia Springborg, which is the Cambridge companion to Hobbes' Leviathan, the edited work. You can refer to know more about Hobbes' political thought and particularly his Leviathan. So, these are some of the texts you should refer to. Do let us know what you think about this lecture and share your comments and feedbacks. We will be happy to hear and respond to. Thanks for your listening. Thank you all.